Welcome to Women in Entertainment's In Her Words podcast. I'm Renee Rossi.
And I'm Gretchen McCourt.
And today we're sitting down with CNBC's Julia Boorstin. Recently, Julia just published her book, When Women Lead.
We think you'll really enjoy this episode and the findings Julia had speaking to hundreds of the top women executives in the U.S.
Well, we are so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. This is so exciting.
I am very excited to have you here just because of my background and being able to interview you about your history, your background, as well as just your holistic career. So it's like I started pitching you, I think, in 2007, like pieces on Jeffrey Katzenberg.
And that was right after I started at CNBC.
Yeah, you were brand new.
Yeah.
And I had just started and I was representing Jeffrey and DreamWorks in LA and I was pitching you and it was like, so I was like a baby, like nervous pitching you.
And I was a baby journalist. So I love it.
So I guess why don't we kind of just start? How did you get into broadcast journalism? I know that you started at Fortune. Maybe we start there. And I know stemming from your book, When Women Lead, that was just recently published. You talked a little bit about in the intro about, how you started at Fortune and some of the experiences you had. So why don't we start there?
So I've only had 2 jobs, which is kind of crazy because I graduated from college in 2000. And I started straight after college graduation as a reporter at Fortune magazine. I was 21 years old. I was the youngest person they'd ever hired. And I was a young reporter, and I actually applied to a bunch of magazines and newspapers, and this was the best reporting job. And I didn't think I was going to be interested in business news, but I quickly fell in love with it and got this amazing education from these editors and reporters who I was working with there. And when I was at Fortune, I started appearing as a contributor on CNN because at the time, Fortune and CNN were owned by the same parent company, which was then called Time Warner. It's since then been split up and rearranged in various pieces. But they used to put journalists on CNN to talk about stories they'd written. And I remember going on the first time when I was 22. I thought the whole thing was ridiculous. I thought it was hilarious that they were having me on live television to talk about business news. And because I thought it was so hilarious, and I didn't even bother getting nervous, basically. So I just had a big goofy smile on my face and they were like, oh, she looks comfortable. Let's have her back on. So I became a contributor to CNN while I was writing at Fortune and sort of fell into this great environment with a great boss and mentor and this regular routine on CNN a couple times a week. And that ultimately led me to taking a full-time job at CNBC back in 2006, a million years ago.
Oh my gosh. But you've put such an imprint at CNBC. It's like you've created the Disruptor 50 list. You've done documentaries there. Have you, in terms of just being a female in broadcast journalism, did you have mentors at CNBC? I know in your book you talk a little bit about Andy Sewer at Fortune and what a great example he was for you. How has mentorship kind of informed or helped you along the way in terms of your path?
This is something I talk about with so many women. And since my books come out, mentorship has been a consistent thread because I think everyone's sort of curious, who are those people who are so influential in your career? And at Fortune magazine, hands down, it was Andy Sewer. He was my boss. I reported a lot of stories with him and he really pushed me outside of my comfort zone. And he was the one who said, yeah, go on TV. And I said, I don't know what I'm doing. He said, nobody knows what they're doing. Just go on TV. You'll be fine. And I think he really pushed me to go in that direction. And then there were some other people like Cara Loomis, who was this legendary, much older editor at Fortune. And I was terrified of her and also idolized her. And she took the time to really teach me and some other young journalists about how to read SEC documents. And I think this sense of understanding the value of what she was teaching us and that these would be skills that we would use for forever, how to really dig into the numbers was really sort of empowering and also something that I'm still grateful for to this day. At CNBC, I think, you mentioned all these things I've done since I've been there in the past 16 and a half years. And the reality is that I've been at the same company for many years, but it's an environment which has enabled me to be incredibly entrepreneurial. So, every day I'm pitching stories and I'm, reacting to the news, but also pitching stories, which feels entrepreneurial to me. Yeah. But I've had the opportunity to create these really fun franchises. You mentioned Disruptor 50. I've always been totally fascinated by entrepreneurs and this sort of innovator mindset. And clearly I'm very risk averse, having had 2 jobs myself, but really fascinated by people who took crazy risks to try to change the world with their businesses. So I pitched to my boss at the time at CNBC and said, we should be doing more on startups. And I know at CNBC, we're so focused on public companies, but here's a framework where it would really make sense for us to talk about startups as either becoming the next generation of public giants or disrupting the ones that are out there today. So they said, go for it. And that's been my baby for the past 10 and a half years. And we're about to start working on our 11th annual list. And so I really love the idea of like being able to create new things within this established structure. This other project that I initiated was called Closing the Gap. And that's highlighting the companies and individuals who are making great strides to close gender and diversity gaps.
Yeah.
I clearly love positive stories because I do think it's really important to shine a spotlight on people who are either doing really important things when it comes to innovation or really important things in terms of, taking big steps towards equity in the workplace.
Yeah. In terms of broadcast, I just think back, 20 years ago, and everybody knew Marita Bartiromo, the Money Honey on CNBC. And so much has changed since then. It's like you've seen so many women who have really taken CNBC by storm, you being one of them. How has that culture shifted internally?
So I feel very lucky to be of a generation of women who I think are really interested in helping each other. And I think back to my early days as a young reporter with Rebecca Jarvis, and she's now been at ABC. She's now at ABC. She's been at CBS. She's an amazing, amazing reporter. And when we started out, someone saw us out having, I think we were having drinks one night. We were friends. We started sitting and we instantly became friends. And someone said to us, you girls shouldn't be friends with each other. You should be rivals. You should hate each other. And I remember she and I looked at each other and we were like, huh? We're like, because we were clearly young women in the same network trying to make our way in this crazy world. We looked at each other and we're like, we're not going to run our careers that way. Like, that's not going to be the way we operate. And to this day, she's a great friend and she did a great story on my book. And I feel like generationally, we're of this generation that really wants to help each other. And I have benefited so much from my colleagues at CNBC of all genders. And it's just been great to see the way that, I do think things have changed.
Yeah.
And I hear so many horror stories of women in the business world, whatever the culture was in the 80s and 90s, when there was really only room for one woman in the room, one woman around the table, one woman in the boardroom, one woman in the C-suite. So they knew that if they let another woman in, they were going to lose their spot. And I do feel like things have changed, particularly in the past 10 years. But it's interesting, being at CNBC, I'm out here on the West Coast. CNBC is mostly in Englewood Cliffs and in New York. And obviously there are reporters around the country. But I feel very grateful to have my email relationships with my colleagues, and then a couple great colleagues out here on the West Coast as well. And I behave as if I'm part of the San Francisco bureau. We have an amazing female West Coast bureau chief. And so I'm up there as much as I can as well to be part of that team because it's an awesome, awesome team.
That's fantastic. In your book, you had talked a little bit about, when you're interviewing folks, on camera, how you had a publicist who called you, and I'm forgetting the interviews, the specific, because it was Warner, was it?
It was Warner. Yes,
Warner,
it was
right?
Warner Media. So,
Warner Media.
so the story was back a couple years ago, Ann Sarnoff was running Warner Media, and she made the very controversial decision during the pandemic to take all of the Warner Media movies and put them out on streaming on HBO Max at the very same time that they were in theaters. It was controversial. There were filmmakers that were upset.
Yeah.
They had to reimburse people. It was a whole thing. And so I was very excited. I got to do an interview with her and ask her all these tough questions that everyone was wondering. So I did an interview with her, I think it was December of 2020. And at the time, I was reporting on my book. I was working on my book in the evenings and weekends. And I just done all this research about ways in which women were judged more harshly. And that was sort of sitting in the back of my head. But I did a great interview with her. I asked her tough questions. She gave me smart answers. And we went on with our day. Afterwards, we emailed, talked about the next interview we would do. And I felt good about it. Didn't have any second thoughts. A couple days later, I got a phone call from a senior male communications executive who I was actually in talks with about trying to book his CEO to do an interview with me as well on CNBC.
Was this someone you worked with before?
Someone I'd worked with before
Okay.
and I'd known for years. And like we had I thought, a perfectly cordial relationship. And he called me up and I was trying to book his CEO, who was a man, and as most CEOs are men. And he said to me, that interview you did with Ann Sarnoff, he said, I thought you seemed really mean. Your tone just seemed really harsh. And I was like, what? What are we talking about
I
here?
don't think I've ever seen you give a mean or harsh interview.
Well, I try to be fair my whole career.
Yeah.
My whole goal is to be fair and to do my homework and to be fair. Those are my priorities. So when he said this to me, my first instinct was like, oh, I should panic. I must have done something wrong. I need to go back. I need to review the tape. Maybe I was too harsh. Was my tone inappropriate? But then I remembered all this research I had just done for my book about the ways in which women are judged more harshly than men are. One of the ways women are judged more harshly is women are typically given feedback on their style rather than their substance. And there's this underlying current throughout all these double standards that women are expected to be warm and nurturing pretty much all the time. And when they don't demonstrate warmth and nurturing, it conflicts with this expectation of how they're supposed to behave. And so it causes this harsher judgment. So when he said this to me, I had that moment of panic. Did I do something wrong? And then I remembered all this research that I'd been digging through, a couple nights before. And I said, gee, would you have given that same feedback to one of my male colleagues? I thought the interview was really fair.
Yeah.
And I felt in that moment so bolstered by this research and also able not to take this personally. Like,
Yeah.
I hadn't done anything wrong. And I did go back and watch the interview, but I knew that actually what he was commenting on was this expectation of warmth and nurturing. It would be so weird if I demonstrated warmth and nurturing in all my interviews with CEOs, but there was something about my behavior or my tone or my just going about my business exactly as how a male colleague would have that sort of was off for him. And he said, I have to think about it. Maybe you're right. And I was like, glad he recognized that there. But
Yeah.
it was a really interesting moment. And for me, that's when I realized, and I was in the middle of writing this book, it's so important to understand what you're up against in terms of double standards, because then it can take the sting out of it. I didn't spend a night spiraling about what I might have done wrong. I was like, oh, I understand what that comment was about. And it had nothing to do with me and everything to do with his expectations of how women are supposed to be. And so there was something about it that was so empowering and liberating that I was like, I know how to write this chapter now.
And it's amazing that you could recognize that in yourselves, where a lot of women would be insecure. Like, I would probably go off and I would be nervous and looking and spiraling.
But I think that it was so funny because that interview happened to come as I was really struggling with all this data about double standards. My book is incredibly inspiring. It's incredibly optimistic. There are so many reasons why I'm optimistic about female leadership, also about all this data indicating that if people who are women and people of color who have historically not had access to financing in order to be able to launch companies, all of the data indicates that they should be raising more money because all the data indicates that their companies tend to outperform. And also, study after study after study shows that diversity in management of companies and at companies yields better results. So all of this data so inspiring and optimistic. And if people follow the data, the money will follow. But I was like, there's also so much research about double standards, so many double standards. And so I was really struggling with how to make sense of this really depressing information about double standards and how pervasive and complex they are, and bring that into my book that's so fundamentally optimistic. But what I realized is laying out those double standards is what you need to do to navigate obstacles. And you cannot scale a mountain unless you know how high it is. You can't burst through a boulder unless you know exactly what the size is. And there was something to me about, okay, this is why I need to help people understand what they cannot control. And I feel like my whole life, especially since I've been a mom, I've been all about the serenity prayer. Like, if there's something you can't control, just try not to think about it because it's out of your control. But what I realized is there are so many things that people, especially women in the workplace, cannot control. Double standards, stereotypes, bias are part of them. And actually take the time to understand it, because yes, you can't control it, but if you understand it, you'll be able to better navigate around it.
You can recognize it. That's so interesting, that the data but how do we get this? How do we get that data, that information, and that optimistic outlook to the next generation, or the that are coming up? I mean, books, texted about your book for the last 2 weeks. We're like, oh my gosh, did you read that chapter? Did you? Because we knew people and we knew the instances, but how do we get that in their hands? How is it in, whether it's, it doesn't have to be in business school because not everyone goes to business school, but
Yeah.
how do we get
Yeah.
that information in people's hands? Because it really is optimistic and it really is, we like to say tools in your tool belt, but how do we
Yeah.
get
It's
the
also
data out there?
inspiring, right?
Yeah,
It's
it's
like
hopeful.
I
Hopeful.
think one of the things, because I know so many women entrepreneurs, even just starting my own business, us starting this business,
Yeah.
right? It's how do you find the inspiration, but also the courage to teach yourself and educate yourself around, how do you run a P&L? How do you understand your tax return on that
Right,
level?
right.
Like it's all of these different things, how do you hire? How do you, fire? How do you lead with empathy? How do you create community? And how do you educate for that, or how do you inspire women to do that? And I think
Well,
that's something.
I hope my book can provide a little bit of a
No,
roadmap for
100%.
that.
It does.
But I
it
also
does.
think that one reason I want to write my book is because I as a journalist was seeing women succeed by leading in their own ways and not feeling like they had to fit themselves into some sort of box, and to wear the boxy suit and to fit in with the guys and act like a traditional archetypal, stereotypical male leader. And so I think part of it is understanding that this is what leaders look like. There are 60 women I quote in the book. They're incredibly diverse in their backgrounds and in their approaches. And this idea that leaders can come in all these different shapes and sizes and lead in ways that are truly authentic to them. And success comes not from fitting into a box of what you think a leader should do and what they should act like, but actually figuring out what you're good at, pushing yourself to improve, and surrounding yourself with people who can complement you. And so I think a lot of it is like understanding that you don't have to be someone else to be a successful leader. And then, of course, there are all the nuts and bolts of things you have to learn. But I actually feel like there are more resources around that stuff now than there ever have been before.
Yes, definitely. Well, your story of starting at Fortune, and I think that's just so interesting for so many of our listeners and our members are young, coming out of school, and they still, even in this day and age, think, what's my major? What does my major? So can you talk a little bit about, we like to talk about pivots and things that just kind of happen. Some were deliberate, some happened, but some that might have been accidental, but like
Totally.
where step 1, 2, and 3 don't have to lead to 4, 5, and 6.
Well, I was going to go to grad school and study international relations. I got in and I never went. And it's interesting. I just actually was with one of my best friends from college last week, and we were talking about how our lives have turned out more than 20 years later so differently than what we thought when we were seniors in college.
Right.
And I think so much of it was about seeing where the open door was and walking through it, even if it was not in an area which you thought you'd be interested in, or which you had studied, or which you thought you would like, or that you knew anything about, but just saying, what's the best opportunity for me to seize now? And let me push myself outside my comfort zone and do it just because that's where the open door is. And my friend had been laid off after the internet bubble burst in 2001. She was talking about how that led her on this journey that ultimately led her to law school and to where she is now. Anyways, it was a fascinating sort of a story that we were sort of talking about how we ended up in these different places, not because we did what we thought we were going to do at all. And for me, I was like, I'll take a year in New York. All my friends were going to move to the city from where I was in college in Princeton. I was like, this will be fun. I'll take a break before I go to grad school. And for me, it was like I applied to 25 places and I got a job offer as a fact checker somewhere and writing captions somewhere else. And there was actually a reporter job at Fortune magazine. I had never taken econ. I'd never taken statistics. I really didn't think I cared about business at all. I was like, oh, this is going to be boring. I'd rather work at Entertainment Weekly. And then within a week of being at Fortune, I was like, wow, this is really interesting. And I think that the hard thing, especially when you're just starting out, is you don't know what you're going to like, and you really don't know what you're going to be good at until you start doing it. And it's kind of impossible to really know until you're already in it. I mean, there are a couple of examples. I mean, I would say of exceptions to that. Like, for instance, a lot of these schools that are teaching journalism now, they have the students go out and like shoot their own packages and actually do the thing. Whereas I sort of was more thrown into it and learned on the job. And I do think that there's a sense of like, is this something I like doing? What part of this do I like? What part do I not like? But my advice to young people is just like get experience, whatever the thing is. I was talking to a woman who wants to be a director. I was like, start shooting short films, because like the whole Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours thing, you just need to get the practice. And I actually think back to like, you can get access to tools about how to do a P&L. Like you can learn so much more now because of the resources that are available
Yeah.
online.
Absolutely.
You can learn anything on YouTube, can't you?
I tried to learn how to tie a bow tie on YouTube. It's really hard. It's like deceptively hard.
Well, and I think something else interesting for young people now, and maybe this is a product of the pandemic, what you were talking about of starting your own, kind of your own side hustle with inside your company
Yeah.
and pitching that idea, because there's such a mentality now of I have to leave my job to go do this. And I don't know how many how many tens of thousands of millions of startups happened during the pandemic, and people deciding, which was forced upon them a little bit. But I think that's also optimistic and also hopeful, that to say, I like my company. Maybe I don't think I'll be here for 50 years, but the thought of I can be in this safe, secure, risk-averse
Yeah.
world, but I can still be creative and I can still start things. I think that's a really interesting message
And I
for
do think
people.
and that's why, I mean, I didn't realize that we are all leaders until I was writing this book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And someone said to me, well, you're a leader. I'm like, what am I a leader of? I've been in the same job for 16 years. They said, no, what you're doing and creating these things is a leadership approach to the world. And what I realized is that everyone's a leader in one way, shape, or form, whether you're doing your kids' PTA or you're fundraising for a nonprofit. Everyone is
Yeah.
leading in their own way. And I think it's really about understanding how to unlock those leadership skills, no matter what context you're in.
Yeah.
I think is really important. And I think you're right. You can be entrepreneurial in any environment too. And I also think there's this phenomenon of people who are doing something that's a side hustle, whether it's baking elaborate cakes to sell for kids' birthday parties or doing something creative and selling your art. I just feel like there's an opportunity both to be entrepreneurial within a more traditional corporate context,
Yeah.
or as a side hustle.
Mhm.
And I have a friend, Patrick McGinnis, who wrote a book called, I think it's called something, it's about spending 10% of your time. I'm going to butcher the name, but it's about spending 10% of your time on your sort of personal pursuits, and how you can, I mean, 10% is not a
Yeah.
lot, and you can
Mhm.
sort of find a way to do that. This is my 10% project.
Well, it's interesting because I remember Bob Safian, when he was editor-in-chief of Fast Company, he wrote about Generation Flux, about how this new generation really, they don't look at jobs the way our parents looked at jobs. They don't look at it as, here's 10 or 15 years of my life or 20 years of my life. They're like, here's 2 years of my life, and then I want to figure out my hustle.
Yeah.
And now that's kind of blending, where what is that going to look like, especially in light of how the environment has changed, which I
Well,
think
and
will be
it's good for the
interesting.
companies too.
Yeah.
You don't lose the talent, you don't lose that history, and the company's gaining as well. And if there's ownership, whatever the details are inside, it could be a benefit for both. I think that's a really interesting, opportunity that not a lot of young people probably see yet.
Yeah, and I mean, I see it in terms of demand from the corporate side. I report on disruptors, which are the startups challenging the big established companies.
Mhm.
But the big established companies all need to innovate. Everyone needs to innovate right now. Whether you're talking about generative AI and Chat GPT or whatever it is, everyone needs to figure out how to innovate internally. And I think there's a huge opportunity for these big companies to think about evolution. What do we need to do to keep up and to make sure we don't get put out of business and become a Kodak or a Xerox
Yeah.
or one of these companies
Yeah.
that their original business sort of disappeared because technology moves so quickly.
And
Yeah.
they just thought that
Absolutely.
that they didn't need to. Well, I don't know what I was reading. Maybe it was because of what's his name, CEO of Netflix, saying he was going to retire.
Reed
But I
Hastings,
went back, yeah, Reed Hastings. I went back and read that the white paper on Blockbuster, saying no to that $5 million offer to buy Netflix. And they were like, nope, it's never going to work. It's never going to work. And, there's some really
But
interesting.
what I think is so interesting about what that means for young people who are trying to or anyone trying to figure out their careers is that nothing is static. It's not like
Yeah.
you start a company, working at a company when you're 21 years old and you're going to be doing the same thing for your whole life. The technology 10 years from now is going to be
Yes.
so different that all of our lives and jobs are going to be different. And like what my kids do when they're, I have an 11-year-old, what he does when he's 25, we can't even imagine yet.
No,
I have no idea what he's
no.
going to be doing because the world will be such a different place. So I think it's more about figuring out how you want to be doing your work, what you find interesting, and how to push yourself regardless of what it is that you're doing. And that's why I think this idea of like unlocking your leadership superpowers, who knows what the technology is going to be in
Yeah.
15 years, but if you could keep learning new things, then it's exciting and not terrifying.
Mhm.
True. When you were coming up, it's like, you had talked when you started at Fortune, obviously you have your kind of like your girl tribe with like Rebecca Jarvis that you had already mentioned. were you I'm assuming you left Fortune before the like Fortune Most Powerful Women started,
No,
or you were there?
I went to a couple of Fortune Most Powerful Women's conferences,
Okay.
both when I was at Fortune and when I was at CNBC, and I reported on them for CNBC, which was great. And that's an amazing experience. And I
Yeah.
remember going from, most Fortune events and most business events in general, there were a handful of women and a ton of men. And that's just what it was like. And there were many times I'd walk into a room and I'd be the only woman. But Fortune Most Powerful Women, I just remember going around, there must have been 300 women, and everyone was introducing themselves because Patty Sellers, who created this franchise, wanted to give a sense that people actually knew each other. And I get chills remembering this feeling of having all these amazing women in the room who didn't know each other. And that was why it felt so important to convene these women. But that was very inspiring. And I've interviewed thousands and thousands of people, but because the women are so rare, you notice when they're doing things differently, and you notice that they are judged differently. And they also oftentimes, because they don't fit what the stereotype looks like, maybe feel liberated to do things a different way.
Yeah. It's like I couldn't imagine what the vibration in that room was like.
It's pretty exciting. Yeah. I haven't been to one in a while, but I can't wait to go back.
Because it's like I asked because, when you started thinking about when women lead, what inspired the book? Where did when did you start getting that passion for women entrepreneurs and leadership?
It's interesting because I think it goes back to my Disruptor 50 list, because I created the list in I think our first list. So we just had our 10th year. So we're talking about, 11 years ago.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about entrepreneurs. And the lists were largely male dominated because men draw the vast majority of all these venture capital dollars. So last year, women drew 2% of all VC dollars, down from an average of 3% in the prior decade. So I was seeing, when I was doing this Disruptor 50 list, how rare the women were, but also how different their approaches were and how different their companies were than their male counterparts. So on one hand, I was seeing how little access to capital they had. And then I was saying, okay, well, of course they're different. They've had to be exceptional to get here. So I around the time of the Me Too Time's Up movement, I was reporting on a lot of these men getting fired, in part because I covered media and tech. So like I'd interviewed Travis Kalanick, I'd interviewed Les Moonves. So many of these men who got fired are people I had interviewed. And so I would report on the people losing their jobs, Harvey Weinstein, all of these different situations. But what I realized is it wasn't enough just to report on what men were doing wrong. I wanted to highlight the companies that were doing things to change the culture so this kind of bad behavior wouldn't happen, and also to create a more equitable workforce. So again, back to my loving telling positive stories, I wanted to shine a spotlight on companies that were doing the right thing and also show that it's not rocket science. Like closing gender and racial pay gaps, first of all, is not that impossible. Anyone can copy these approaches that I was chronicling, but also it's the right thing to do for the business. It's not just the right thing to do for people, but you will be more successful as a business if you're thoughtful about these things, and you don't have to worry about people quitting and losing their jobs. So I was starting to do these closing the gap segments that was A, trying to shine a spotlight on people doing the right thing, and B, also I kept on coming across all this data about the lack of access to capital that women were getting. So I more and more was feeling like it's not enough to talk just about what men have done wrong. I really want to talk about what women are doing right and tell the stories that people don't know.
Yeah.
And there are so few female entrepreneurs. The focus is usually on the same couple of stories over and over. And on also, to be honest, on the spectacular failure of people like Elizabeth Holmes. And she had a crazy story. She was a fraud. I watched all the scripted shows and the documentaries. I consumed all the content along with everyone else. But the problem is that she can't be the only example of a female CEO in the tech world out there. We need more positive examples to show and demonstrate that she's just the weird exception to the rule. She's not definitive of a whole generation.
Yeah.
So I was really fascinated by these female leadership stories of women I was interviewing, and I would leave these interviews just bursting with enthusiasm and excitement. I would just be so thrilled about the stories I had heard, many of which were off camera. And I thought, I need more people to know these stories. Women need to know these stories. They're so inspiring. And then the more and more interviews I did with women for the book, the more I saw these clear through lines of common skills and strategies that they were deploying to defy those crazy odds, to succeed despite having access to 2% of capital. And that led me to all of this academic research. And I read about 300 academic studies explaining why their skills and strategies were so incredibly effective. And these are all things that many of them we have within us already, but are things that we could start to really unlock and deploy with more intention.
It's like I wonder when VCs will start. It's almost like we're still screaming from the hills. It's, like even though we're shining a light on it, it's overlooked. It's just things are not changing fast enough.
They're not changing fast enough. And a big reason why is because the big checks are going to male founders. And the women, there are more seed stage funds and A stage funds that are focused on female founders. But like $300 million check was written to Adam Newman after the implosion of WeWork. And this was for a pre-revenue company. So that's a very big check. And that does skew the numbers if you have a couple of those and the women are getting tiny checks in comparison.
Is there anything out of the off camera and on camera that you were doing for the book that really surprised you? Was there something do you still get shocked and surprised at this point?
The book was reporting. The book was amazing, and I was doing it during the pandemic, so it felt like in a lot of ways a really lucky time to report this book. First of all, because everyone was home and they said yes when I asked them for interviews. But also, I feel like everyone was very reflective. And just thinking about like, why am I doing what I'm doing? What do I care about? What do I want other people to know about my business or my approach to the world? And it felt like this moment of kind of raw vulnerability. And there were a couple of women who, when I was fact checking with them later, were like, oh my God, did I tell you that? And I'm like, yes. So I think there was something very personal about it. And I think you'll find that in the stories. But there's something I think about almost every day, which is this idea that gratitude can be a strength in business. And I, as a mom, I always thought of gratitude as something you feel with your family, with your friends. And I just never thought of it as a business trait. But there's so much, but it kept on coming up in interviews. So many women were like, I'm grateful I have the opportunity to do my business. I'm grateful I had this horrible experience and this lawsuit because it led me to launch my business. Like all these different ways women were talking about gratitude and the idea that could actually drive better results in business because you're able to use the gratitude to have patience, not go for the near-term win, but go for the long-term opportunity. That's something I think about a lot when I'm trying to like figure out how to prioritize things. I'm like, let me just be grateful for where I am, not be in a panic and think what kind of smarter decisions I can make, but where I'm spending my time or what I'm prioritizing, or what kind of bets I'm making in terms of my own pitches for my work, because I do think that was such a surprise for me, not something I was at all aware of before.
When you're looking at the stories that you do, obviously you're on CNBC, so it's breaking. So you're market driven. Are there other projects that you're thinking about?
Well, I do love our Disruptor 50 list. And I love looking at cutting edge technologies. And to me, what's so interesting, back to like how fast everything's changing, is that now there's this whole new wave of, generative AI and how that's going to change things. And, I cover the media industry and it's been totally transformed by things like Netflix over the past several decades. So I'm always just curious about sort of what that next technological innovation is going to be that's going to drive change. And so that's something I'm very excited about right now, just because there's so much going on in that space. I also think that, and this is something I write about a lot in the book, is the rise of purpose-driven companies. And younger people in particular really want to work for companies that are going to have a positive impact beyond just generating revenue and profits. And a lot of research indicates that women are more likely to launch and run purpose-driven companies, and purpose-driven companies tend to outperform. So a lot of reasons why women should be doing this and why we should be paying attention to these companies. But I think especially with everything going on in the environment, I think companies that are really working to address environmental issues and social issues, they are in the spotlight, and I think they will continue to be in the spotlight. And I'm fascinated by sort of all the way these things can work together and how doing good can help you do well financially. And these things are super intertwined and they're not separate. It's not about, making money so you can donate the money. It's about figuring out ways that you can have a positive impact on the world and make money while doing it.
Yeah. Do you see yourself being an entrepreneur yourself at some point? Starting your own production company or documentary?
I feel like writing the book was like
was
my launching my
your
little company.
gig?
I don't know. I feel like this book has been so interesting, and the conversations I've had with women since it have been so fascinating and surprising
Yeah.
that I feel like right now I'm just focused on that. But I definitely admire entrepreneurs. There's something about the willingness to take a risk and try new things that I think it really requires conviction, and I'm very inspired by it, even if maybe I haven't officially done it myself.
No, you did. The book. Is there book number 2? Was there enough
I
material
think
that
there's, oh gosh, I could fill thousands of pages just with the stories of phenomenal women that I've interviewed and I've met. And I couldn't even fit all the women I interviewed in here because this is a 400-page book. There, I didn't want to make it too unwieldy. But no, I think there's definitely another book. And by the way, I hope that the story about the challenges that female entrepreneurs face, I hope it gets better in 5 years. And I hope that there are better statistics
Yeah.
to share in a couple of years. So we'll see how things change. But I really loved writing the book, and mostly I loved getting to interview 120 amazing women. It was so inspiring, and and the fact that I could do it all during the pandemic, it was such a delightful break from the insanity of what was going on in the world, which I was reporting on during the day at CNBC.
Are there, when you're looking at your stories that you're pitching at this point, because obviously it's breaking news, but are there any stories that you're pitching, or do you approach any stories where you're like, I want to do a female entrepreneur, series, or
Well, we're doing a lot of stuff for Women's History Month, and we've done a lot of work on pay equity.
yeah,
And I think it's really important, and we'll continue to do these stories, but really important to just sort of point out how the data indicates that there should be more diversity.
yeah,
Like CNBC is a business network. People want to make money, and that is absolutely what we're focused on. And I want to point out that the data indicates that if you want to make money, you should be hiring equitably, you should be promoting equitably, and you should also be making sure you're paying people equitably, not because you want to do anything other, not just
yeah,
because it's the right thing to do. And I think that a lot of the conversation about DEI initiatives
yeah,
has become like, oh, it's a corporate perk. We're doing this to be nice to our employees. And I think that kind of misses the point. And I think that companies need to understand that this is a financial imperative. And so
yeah,
that's something that we're really trying to highlight in our work when there's data around it. So there's a new index or a new ETF of female CEOs. So it's companies, small and mid-cap companies with female CEOs are just launched in January. So I'm
Interesting.
keeping an eye on it to see how it performs. So far, it's been outperforming, but I think that'll be really interesting to see.
My one question for you is, do you feel like there's increased pressure on you? I think journalism right now has such a light on it. And feel free to say you don't want to answer it,
Yeah.
but journalism has a light and it's under a magnifying glass in terms of reporting styles. Do you feel that from what is your perspective on that as a journalist? And then
Do
second,
you mean in terms of political
of
journalism?
whether it's political journalism or favoritism or nepotism, there's just so much in terms of which way a network
believability.
goes.
I mean, I think that's why I love doing business journalism.
Yeah.
And I think that political journalism is complicated, right? It's
Yeah.
like, there are so many different elements to that and perspectives and it's a very complicated thing. And I
Yeah.
think that like there's also a lot of journalism that's a more gossipy journalism,
Yeah.
in the entertainment space. But I love business journalism because it's about facts.
Yeah.
And as you could tell, my 40 pages of endnotes for my book. I
Yeah.
love data. And I think that at the end of the day, we're telling stories about companies that have numbers to make,
Yeah.
and that's one beauty of the focus of CNBC on publicly traded companies is I think it sort of gives this lens, a very serious lens to approach stories. I mean, ultimately all our stories are about ideas and people and trends, social trends about,
Yeah.
whether it's about Peloton or Airbnb, like how people are spending their money and their time.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, there is this element of hard facts that are underlying everything.
Yeah.
And so, as I report on earnings, you're talking about numbers. So there's
Yeah.
something that's really grounding about that. And I think really enables business journalism to be serious and unbiased.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on today. And, we've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and it's always a pleasure to see you, Julia.
Thank you so much for
Thank
having me.
you.
I'm so glad you enjoyed the book, and congrats on the podcast.
Thank you. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe and leave a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. To stay up to date with In Her Words, join the conversation by following Women in Entertainment on our social channels and subscribe to our weekly newsletter at womeninentertainment.com.